Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Prazify podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support me at Subscribestar, Locals, Buy Me a Coffee. And we are joined again by Rain today. How you doing, Rain? It's been a while.
Yeah, doing great. Glad to be here. Got a lot of really busy at work the last few months, but managed to find some time to discuss today's subject.
Well, yeah. So this sort of got started in a private DM that we had. I had done a video at this point, maybe about a month ago, about the geopolitical influence of the steppe, both past and present. And I had a theory that one of the reasons why Western Europe was able to develop. So in historical and sociological terms, we have this concept called the Great Divergence. When in 1500, Western Europe just takes this escape velocity and just leaves all of its competitors behind. And that's due to the financial revolution, the technological revolution, statecraft, all sorts of things. But they all kind of come together at around 1500. And then the question is, why in Western Europe and why nowhere else? Now, there's a lot of explanations for that, and the thing that I wanted to add to that was not a was a new explanation, but not one that necessarily excluded others. And I argued that, unlike say all those areas around the steppe, Eastern Europe and Russia, the Middle East and China, who were getting continually raided by the nomads, Western Europe eventually was spared that as the European civilization expanded eastward due to the conversion of these states to Christianity, specifically beginning around the 11th century with Scandinavia and Hungary and Poland becoming Catholic and Russia becoming Orthodox. And I asked Rain what he thought, and you were saying that, well, you didn't really think that China was going to develop a scientific civilization on its own, regardless whether it was invaded or not. And so that's sort of like the how this episode came to be.
Yes, glad to be here. So I'm just gonna share screen so that we can have our main subject. Now, okay. So like Todd said, we first started this discussion regarding the development of scientific society. So when I shared my thought with Todd was basically that uh, it wasn't the fact that China was raided by the steppe nomad and that the Western Europe was mostly unscathed, but a rather more fundamental reason. So first, I will explain why I don't think that China didn't develop because of the steppe nomad. Because for a lot of Chinese dynasties, they were not raided by steppe nomad. For example, the Hainai dynasty defeated the steppe nomad, and they were like a peace, a lack of steppe nomad for almost 1,000 years. And during that period, China was very wealthy. So wealth is not a reason for why China didn't develop modern science. We can also not say it because of things like free market or property right or individuality, because those uh, things like free market, individualism, and general wealth is not really unique to what happened in Western Europe. They were in the China's past is very actually free, have a lot in many time was very free market, and Eastern culture being less individualistic is more of a misconception than reality. So I personally have a more, I would say, fundamental theory on why China never developed a, a science society, but Europe did. I think the reason is that the Western civilization since the Greek, Roman, and Europe has always been very adept at at developing complex conceptual framework. And in the Chinese civilization, even though we are very good at applied science, at building machinery based on engineering and empirical work, we kind of hit a wall because there's only so much you can do using empirical research, but without a complex conceptual framework behind it. So basically, we never developed modern scientific society because we never developed modern mathematics, and we never developed modern mathematics because we never developed like the same kind of conceptual with the philosophy with a lot of concept like is very present in the West. So that's basically my main idea.
So by that you mean China can't build. The Chinese have a difficult time building abstract theoretical models.
Yes,
Okay.
and yeah, and just saying that, and also just to give an example that China have no problem developing technology. I think that in the Ming or the Tang Dynasty, the Chinese alchemists were good enough to create refrigeration. So pretty much during the summer, if you want a cold drink, they can cook up with some chemical reactions and to create like cold drinks during the summer, or they can create like very accurate machinery to predict like earthquake, for example. But without a conceptual framework, like a very complex mathematical and conceptual framework behind it, there's it hit limit basically.
Well, okay, but then what about Japan though? Japan, which is a Siniatic civilization culturally, what has been a world leader in technological innovation since the Meiji Restoration of 1868. What makes Japan different?
Uh, it actually doesn't make Japan different because they got introduced technology and modern math from the West. They didn't. So basically my point would be that like Asiatic civilization are very much capable technologically. Is more the conceptual framework behind it that is more lacking. Is like that YouTube video I shared with you about that in last April there was like a conference in China. It's like the point is, even though in many field of science and technology China is as advanced or even surpassed the West in many fields. In the field of pure mathematics, China is still like very much behind, and according to that mathematician, is at least 80 to 100 years behind the current U.S. and Europe. So we have to distinguish like the conceptual framework behind it. The math, the arithmetic, the concept structure behind it, and the science and technology.
Okay, so I think now we have like two layers here. One is, could an Eastern civilization have developed it in isolation? And I think you're saying no. But then the other thing is, uh, you also seem to be saying that China now can certainly adopt it, but it has a difficult time incorporating and adding to that theoretical base. What
Yes.
I'm saying is, I don't think Japan has that problem. I think
Uh,
Japan has been adding to that theoretical base for quite some time.
uh, I when I say theoretical base is not the again is not the technology. So Japan also like China, they can develop a lot of technology on their own, but they also like China quite behind in terms of pure mathematics, the advanced one. So I guess I could reframe this as like the Asiatic civilization are very innovative in terms of technology and science, but is in terms of the pure concept, metaphysical and stuff that is behind. I don't know if that's
No,
easily
I
clear.
get that, but I guess a second thing, and this is where you might bring up the Western concept again. I would argue that, and you may not consider this West Eastern then, Vedic or Indian civilization. I mean, in fact, that's where we get zero from, right? Which is crucial to modern mathematics, right? Before that, we had the Roman numerals, and then the numerals we now use in mathematics are the Arabic numerals. So you go from like the Indians, the Arabs to the West, and then that is an improvement over the Roman system. Now, if we want to concede that the Hindus could theoretically produce an abstract mathematical system, at one point Buddhism was quite common in China under the Tang Dynasty, for example. Isn't it possible, hypothetically, that China and or Japan could have adopted a kind of Buddhist philosophy in order to um, fill in the deficits?
Uh, I don't think feeling the deficit is a big problem because the world communicates. So, for example, if someone invented the zero, the Chinese can very easily learn, or the Japanese can very easily learn from them, I think is more like develop like the starting point basically of the conceptual framework. And as the Indian example, I think the Indian are more similar to European than to Chinese because they like the European and the Middle Eastern are Indo-Europeans, but the Chinese and the Japanese, Korean, we are not.
Yeah, that is true. I would agree that there is a more commonality between.
And there is, oh yes, also another point regarding to Japan developing technologically. I think I guess I may need to check more on the history of that period, but I would say like when China and Japan they're both introduced to new technology, I would say like as a civilizational season, Japan are more in a more spring period. But by the time when China was introduced to technology, it was already in decline. And when a civilization is already declined, it's actually very hard to integrate new industry and stuff like that. A bit like Ottoman Empire and stuff like that. You can contrast with now when China after the collapse, and went back was able to develop technologically very fast. So I think China versus Japan and industrialization is more because China and Japan was in a different season civilizationally.
Right. So, does your position as far as like abstract concepts? I mean, certainly mathematics and how these concepts relate to each other is an important consideration. And I guess related to that too, though, are what we might call non-mathematical abstract relations. So, like relations of social relations, for example, because on my channel I talk a lot about how technology has influenced and altered human social relations, and somebody had to have that insight prior to building the first factories, for example. And so the it so yeah, it's an overall ability to exist in an entirely mental space. And I do agree that the West or the Indo-Europeans have a supreme advantage in that area.
I think when it comes to conceptualization, I think in terms of social science and concept, the Chinese were quite capable because if you check the ancient 2000 years ago during the period of the 100 school of thought where the Chinese philosophy really blossomed, you're going to notice a stark difference with the Greco-Roman is that most of the Chinese philosophers, they were either about social science or political science, and there were like only one school of thought that is more related to that can be related to stuff like concept and math, but they're a bit like a cult of craftsmen, so they're more engineer than scientists. So so I'll just change my slide. I think I wait yes, I I think I share with you in our private chat is like to the best way to distinguish like the greater tendency of Western thought process versus the Chinese one is like the Western thinking is more like mathematician, science, philosopher, and Chinese or Eastern one is more scientist slash engineer because in the end of the day, the scientist doesn't really create the conceptual framework. He used the conceptual framework created by mathematician, then use that to test result. So I gave these three different verses. I think those three would be the biggest way to distinguish like a Western thought process versus Chinese. So the dominant process. By the way, those things are not really only by me. There are a lot of Chinese thinkers who think that. So the Western, you can see like the Western thinking is like A to B, like how to distinguish clear category. So you got this like grid chain of being, but the dominant process in the Chinese one is A to B, a process. For example, that help you to understand something empirically, but not so much. But the fundamental truth is not as important. So you got the symbol of the yin and yang. This a lot of people mistake this symbol to mean duality, but in reality, these symbols means a process. So if you push too much into the yang, you get the yin. If you push too much so it's basically like this symbol is like process and causality. So this is generally the way, based on what I read in Western civilization and what I know and the Chinese civilization, that's how I guess the best way I can qualify the big difference between the two.
Okay, so what it sounds like you're saying is, in one of the early, so what Plato does, and what makes Plato so important, is he sort of synthesizes two different schools that have been fighting each other. One is Parmenides, which says that everything is sort of static, this sort of unchanging world, reality, and then there's Heraclitus, who says everything is flux. And Plato says, well, the physical world is all in flux, so in that area, Heraclitus is right. But he's wrong in the sense that there's this realm of the forms, this higher realm, where Parmenides is right, where there's things are always the same. And what it sounds like you're saying is that China is more Heraclitan.
Yeah, I would say yes. And that static world of the form is actually very much ignored in Chinese philosophy. That's why a few months ago I say like Chinese doesn't have a metaphysic, but I would say it's not accurate when I say it. It's more like the way that Chinese thinking is that the metaphysic is not relevant that much. So you should focus more on the the physical reality rather than the metaphysical. Like we can go a bit further in when like, we're gonna compare like the different concept of of the Lord of the Western concept and the Chinese concept. I think is caused by that. That can be a part of the answer.
Okay, well, that I think is an important distinction. So let's go to your next point that you have on your slide.
Yeah, yeah. I would say like my next point is like I think one of the reasons why in the Chinese civilization, the metaphysical is not that important. That is the very different conception of the Lord between for example, the Christian versus the Chinese. Because a lot of people don't know, but the ancient Chinese also believe in a true God or Lord, so to speak. And but this Lord is actually not very how do I say mm, involved in the universe. So it is there, but I think the next slide may actually be a better showing. So basically, this is what I the best understand the portfolio of the true Lord in China versus the West. So for example, in the Christianity, the Lord is a creator. It's set the afterlife, the more analytics. The He also take care of the fate and destiny of everything, and there's a end to the existence. There's an apocalypse. There's like an end. But in the Chinese mythology, what we call our equivalent of the Lord that we call the Lord above is behave more like an author to reality, so to speak. It, its portfolio is basically causality, fate, destiny, and change in reality. So basically, I would say like in the Chinese mythological space, the true Lord is not accessible. He may or may not have a plan, or it's just like outside of reality. So there's not really a reason to trying to understand a fundamental truth in opposed to what is in the Middle Ages, like where people try to understand the mind of God by by reaching a deeper understanding of math concept and the universe.
Yeah. So what it sounds like you're saying is that one of the fundamental distinctions between the supreme being in the Western conception and the Chinese conception is this: the Western conception is personal. The supreme being is personal. He makes decisions. He chooses to relate to people, and to in a more broad, you could also include Islam as well, because they
Mm.
have an idea of a God that creates and engages with people. And then the Chinese, it's more like an impersonal. In that regard, I guess it's kind of like Buddhism. Buddhism has a kind of impersonal supreme being.
Uh, Buddhism, not really. The Buddha is very much a person. So I guess we can go to the slide before because there's like a little concept that I like to cover a bit here. When I first came to Canada, actually, like different language may have easier way to say something versus the other. But for me, one of the big thing that made some difficulty in my head is the word God in Chinese and in English and French in Western language. Like for example, in English, God versus the Lord, we both use the word God, right?
Yes.
Yes, but in Chinese, the word for a god like Zeus or the Jade Emperor versus the Lord are are like completely different thing. Are like etymologic. For example, like we use the word Shen or Xian to refer to like a god, but if we refer to the Lord, we refer to the Lord above, and and also, by the way, this concept of the Lord above actually is as old as the Chinese civilization itself. Is actually the word Shangdi, which means like the Lord above, is already present in the oldest oracle script. Like those very ancient Chinese writing. So I actually have like a weird theory about this. Is that like in Greek or Roman, the different god, they also play kind of a bit of a role of a different concept. But in the Chinese one, the god are basically like just very powerful, very powerful being. They don't represent any concept. They are just a bit like they're just very immortal, powerful being, but they don't represent anything fundamental in the universe. So from the gods, there's nothing really fundamental truth to be seeking. They are gods because they're powerful, they're immortal, they create the system for the afterlife, and the Lord is not accessible. So when the gods are just basically more immortal mortals with superpowers, and the Lord is inaccessible, the focus of the life is no longer something like more more concept or some greater truth, but rather to just like focus what you can acquire in this life or next life, and so there's less of a truth seeking nature to it.
Well, so I want to like step in here for the Western conception, because it is confusing that we will in the West use the word God for both Zeus and say God the Father, though of course it's conventional to capitalize the G
Yeah.
for God in that context of God the Father. So in the pre-Christian world, you had the gods who were just immortal superhuman beings. You had demigods who were humans that had at least on one side of their parentage a divine being and could themselves become immortal divine beings. And then there really wasn't any supreme creator god in these pantheons, whether Egyptian, Greek, or Roman. And then with the rise of philosophy, you have this convergence on the idea of one god, to the not necessarily that the other gods don't exist, but they're inferior beings. So the Platonists, the Peripatetics, and the Stoics all converge on the concept of one creator god, alternatively called the One, or the Prime Mover, or the Logos. And of course, the Logos is a term that's picked up and used by Christianity. Christianity then says that there just is this one creator God, and there are no other gods. And of course, they inherit that from Judaism. So they don't really coexist. Once Christianity takes over, the idea of lowercase g gods goes away. They just disappear. You could argue sometimes some of that gets reincorporated in the idea of saints, but they're not immortal beings per se, right? They just have they've been given gifts and rewards in the afterlife. But yeah, you're right. If you have a view of God, the supreme being inaccessible, and being at best disinterested in the world below, you wouldn't really try to spend a whole lot of time trying to understand him and what makes him tick, if even using a personal pronoun is even applicable for such a being. Whereas in the West, it is. And in that regard, I do see certain similarities even with Islam, because like the rise of Aristotle's thought in the West is in part due to Averroes, who's an Islamic scholar, and Avicenna, who's an Islamic scholar as well. And so they were using this material, and then through Spain, it came back into the West. And so they seem to be able to engage in that playback for a while. And so you seem to be saying then that personhood, or the idea that God has personhood, is a key factor in differentiating West from East.
I don't know if personhood is the right term, but rather that I would say like in the Christianity, the Lord is more personally invested in existence, but in the Chinese perception, the Lord is less so. That's why I used the first term. I called the Christian God a creator, but the Chinese God an author. For example, like that's why in our private message I say like the Chinese God is basically, you can understand him as like a mix between Eru, Iluvatar, and plus the Force with some Zinj draw into it, because he's more like like the relation, his relation to the the existence is more like the author and the setting that he created, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So are you saying that in the Chinese conception, the universe is co-eternal with the Lord?
What do you mean by co-eternal? I don't.
Well, so in the Western, you mentioned Christianity created, right? So in the Christian conception, or more broadly the Abrahamic conception of God, God created the universe. So we can say that there was a time when the universe was not, but there never was a time when God was not.
In that case, I would say like the Lord above is very similar to the Christian God, in the sense that the Lord above is kind of eternal. It caused the existence to exist, but it didn't participate to the creation of the earth or nor of the human.
Sorry, I was getting a call there, but okay. So you're saying that the universe did have a beginning in the Chinese cosmology?
Actually, the world, I guess the earth, yes. Existence, no. I would say no. I would say like in the Chinese, but this we need to go and put it into the history. In the origin, because the Chinese, the Lord above, that concept is very old in China. But the concept of the beginning to a universe actually only came to China around the Three Kingdom era. I would say in that case, I would say like in the original Chinese mythology concept, there is no beginning nor end to the existence.
Okay, so the existence, which includes material existence, is
Yeah.
in an infinite cycle. Is that
Yes, you can say that like it always existed, but at no beginning, no end. Yeah.
okay? Okay, because what I'm trying to pin down here is the sort of like conceptual difference. Because for Aristotle, for example, God and the universe are co-eternal, but the universe exists because God is the prime mover, the cause of all being. So even though they're separate, the God is not the universe, and they are co-eternal. It's in the sense that the universe depends on God, not God on the universe. That's not the Christian conception, but what you were talking about sounded kind of like that.
Uh, in that, okay, so the Lord above doesn't depend on the universe, and we do not know what the Lord above with the universe, because we do not access to that. And in the Chinese, I guess in the Chinese philosophy is like, if you're successful, if you achieve what you want, that means like you're doing what the Lord above wanted the role for you to play. For example, the mandate of heaven is basically, I managed to topple the previous dynasty and I won, I become emperor. Then obviously this is the will of the Lord above. You know what I mean?
No, yeah, it's sure. But I guess what I'm trying to pinpoint, and maybe in this process we're getting at the differences
Yeah.
between Eastern and Western thought. The Christian conception, or the Abrahamic conception, is that at one point there was just God. There was nothing else but God. God then creates supernatural beings like angels, and then he creates the physical universe. And that begins at some point in time. And now that's different from, say, like classical paganism, which believed the universe was eternally old and occurred in cycles. Aristotle, of course, believes the universe is eternally old with God. And so I'm trying to figure out which of those two modes of thought what you're describing is more similar to. It sounds more similar to the classical pagan view. Now, again, Lord isn't a bunch of like superhumans running around like the Olympians. I understand that, but
let me think. I would say that okay, in the Chinese mythology, but that was like because we're still talking about different period of history. Like in the early on, I would say there is the Lord above caused existence, and on Earth there were and the well, I guess we can be like a bit like Tolkien, like the Earth versus the universe. On Earth, they were like ancient primordial gods, and one of them created humanity. So I guess it would be because I find it's a bit like it's actually I feel like it's a bit kind of similar to the Tolkien version, except the human are not created by the Lord, but by one of the ancient god that arise from the primordial earth.
mm-hmm. So to sort of not get too lost in this, to try to rub it
Yeah.
back in. If you believe, and I think this is what you're saying, if you believe that the supreme being, the author in this case, is disinterested and unknowable, you're not going to really try to understand him. But
Yes.
it's in the process of understanding the supreme being that you build the theoretical framework for science.
Yes.
Okay, that's the short answer.
Yeah, that is the short answer. That's what I feel the difference between West and East.
Well, I mean, in that regard, I would agree. I mean, one of the common arguments in Western scholarship on the rise of science in Western Europe is precisely this fact that what are some of the preconditions you need to have science? Well, you need to believe that the universe is orderly and rational. You need to believe that your senses are broadly reliable. Otherwise, how could you trust experimental data? Um, and many of the early scientists themselves argued what they were trying to do was understand God's thought processes. Newton, for example, said that. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I would broadly agree. That is an important component of the Western ascendancy in this area.
Yes, that's basically what I feel is the biggest difference between two. However, like I said earlier, this is what allowed the West to create the conceptual framework. But conceptual framework versus the actual piece of technology and the scientific result are still different things.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I guess here's a question, right? Um, the scientific revolution has already happened. It's already expanded across the world. Now, do you think though? I guess it's a twofold question. One is a hypothetical, and then one is like, well, they're both hypothetical, but one's in the past and one's in the future. Do you think it would have been possible for an first question? Do you think it would have been possible for an Eastern civilization to develop an idea of an interested creator God, or is that just not possible with the material we were having to work with an Eastern civilization?
I won't say impossible. I would say like it would be much harder than in Europe. I would say like for example, if the Western civilization, I guess if the Indo-European didn't exist, the Chinese, I guess, would eventually stumble into modern science. But I would say like compared to Europe, the empirical based technology will have developed much further before a true conceptual understanding of science, for example, and mathematics is reached.
Okay, and then I guess the second question I have is, given that you said in some sense China still lags behind in theoretical mathematics, do you think it's possible that some Eastern civilization, presently or in the future, could create such a philosophy or religion, or do you think that that's too difficult?
This I do not fully know, but I do know from that conference of that mathematician is that he think that China should actually put an active effort into the math and conceptual space because you want to, how do I say, cover your weakness, right? And one of his thing, for example, what he said, like the Europe was managed to unlock modern science because they were able to unlock advanced concept and mathematics, and not us. And in the future is actually a matter of security in the future to find a way to cover that weakness. So I guess China will actually be doing it, but not as a religious way, but more like in a, I don't know how to put it. Like you're lacking in a certain field, and you work you work in that field, and you work something just to cover your weakness, so that you are not that much behind that field. If you know what I mean. If you, I don't know if you can phrase it better than me.
Well, so it sounds like what you're saying is this: any attempt to create a grounding for abstract thought would be philosophical rather than theological in China.
Okay, can you repeat? Can you
Yeah,
repeat?
sure. So any grounding within an Eastern civilization for having this built-in drive to build an abstract model mathematically of the world would not be done theologically. And by that I mean by trying to study the nature of God. It would be done philosophically through some sort of uh, principles or values that are derived from philosophical axioms.
Yeah, more philosophical axiom, and also out of like practicality than true search for truth.
Yeah, right. So you're looking for truth, and you know that truth exists in that domain, but your motivation is not to understand God better, but to understand that domain better.
Yeah, to understand that domain better and how to derive practicality out of that truth.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is interesting, right? Because specifically with mathematics, the people that I know who've looked into the history of mathematics will say that a lot of original mathematical breakthroughs in the West were completely non-practical. In fact, many of these breakthroughs were seen as meaningless because they had no practical value. The practical value was only determined later. And so there does seem to be this bias in the West in favor of pure theory for the sake of pure theory, even if it isn't readily apparent how it can be used.
Yes, that is true, and that is something that we have to work on it, because pure theory, yeah, is actually very practical, considering the results.
I would actually argue, though, now in the West, due to, I guess we'll use the Landian term, techno capital, that advantage is being lost. It's really difficult to make a living doing pure theory for the sake of pure theory, and if you can't get paid to do it, most people won't. And then in the past, you usually had some sort of a patron, whether it was the church or aristocrats or a king, and so it didn't matter if it wasn't quote practical. You just had a built-in budget from this patron, and then and with this techno capital demanding competition and innovation, unless what you do can yield quarterly profits, no one's going to pay you for it. So I would argue the West is starting to lose that advantage, at least temporarily.
Yes, I would say that, like, but the West still have this general tendency of theorizing, of building concept and theory. But I would say, like, in the short term, some of the mathematicians may find their place in China. I actually recently saw an article that China were actually grabbing mathematicians from Russia. They get paid them better to like do mathematics because China is more lacking. And also something that I think I haven't mentioned is, like, when I say mathematics, is not doing calculation. Is actually the pure abstract building your concept. This kind of math. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the pure abstract, and yeah. So on the one hand, you do need a sufficiently wealthy population in order to supply that individual with the means of life without that individual being able to provide any obvious benefit practically. Though the expectation will be in the future that it is practical. But that's only to say that wealth isn't unnecessary, but It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition.
Yeah,
Because if you're too poor, you can't pay someone to just think esoteric thoughts all the time.
yeah, I would say like I guess for as an analogy, I would say like wealth, like a wealth and nice market for society is like to have a nice soil to grow plant. But in the end of the day, it depends what kind of seed you plant in it, rather than the soil itself. The soil itself just determine if the condition or nice is nice or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so
Yeah, and I would also add one comment. Like I noticed there were a lot of thinker put the Slav and the Russian outside of the West. But from a more Chinese perspective, and if you consider the nature of this ability to develop advanced concept as what's like as the, uh, the characteristic of the Western man, I would say in that respect, the Russian are actually part of the Western civilization.
in the sense that they can build abstract theoretical models.
Yeah, they think like if you use that as defining
Yeah,
characteristic, the Russian think very much like a Western man.
yeah, they still do. And I guess though the question then becomes, do you want to include Jews and Muslims? Because in a sense, Jews and Muslims share a lot of these metaphysical assumptions, but depending on who you ask, they may not be included in the West proper.
Yeah, that then we end up into politics. I guess the question get too is a new kind of worm. That.
So, but okay, so just to recap, and I want to see if I get this right, and you can tell me if I get it right or not. Your argument is this fundamentally that the Chinese are more practical engineer types, and the West is more abstract philosophical types, and that leads to a divergence in their ability to develop scientific theories and processes. And that's in part rooted in the fact that the Chinese conception of the Lord, the Creator, God, Supreme Being, is abstract, distant, and uninterested in us. And the Western conception of God is that He is. And because He is, the believer, the worshiper, is interested in Him and is then trying to understand Him better. And it's that process that creates the mechanism, the ratchet that builds the metaphysical framework to then develop a scientific society. Is that a nice summary?
Yes, that's a very very good summary. That's basically the core idea.
All right. No, yeah, I think that's certainly it agrees with a lot of what I've already read in the literature on the Great Divergence, because the part of it is why Western Europe? Because I mean, up until like 1500, there wasn't a whole lot to recommend it, right? I mean, the Middle East, India, China, that's where all the great civilizations were, right? And you had Rome in the past, but Rome had fallen, right? So,
Mhm.
what was it? And the religious framework that these people had, I think, is certainly part of it. And also, there's another aspect too, and this is why I don't think we saw a scientific revolution happen in the East, in like Russia. I mean, it eventually did due to exposure, just like it happened in China due to exposure, but they didn't develop it, they didn't drive it. And that's because in the Western conception of God with Augustine, you have strains in both Catholic and Reformed thought where God determines the course of things in a way that would be analogous to an engineer or a planner determining an industrial process.
Mm.
And so, for example, Rudyard Kipling writes a poem about this Presbyterian steam engine operator on a steamboat. And he basically says that he sees the predestination of God in the machine because he views the machine as a replica of God's predestinating the universe. So I think it's not just Christianity per se, because again, the Orthodox didn't really develop science. They just inherited it from the West and they absorbed it, but they didn't really create or drive it.
I have a question. Uh, when did modern mathematics was created?
I mean, are we talking about like with the invention of non-Euclidean geometry, because that's pretty much where things get really different.
Yeah, I guess. Is it Newton that started with calculus and stuff, or something
Well,
earlier?
yeah. So calculus is both Newton and Leibniz. They sort of developed it independently of one another, and I suppose in that sense you could sort of date a huge shift in our understanding of mathematics. And certainly it's Newton that gives us the scientific framework that we use moving forward.
Uh, yeah, Newton, he was very much Christian, and he was also an alchemist. But before Newton, were we or able to, I guess, mathematize uh, reality, or we really need to wait until calculus?
Yeah, I don't really think anybody before Newton was, or I mean, if they were, they might have been like just, obscure thinkers, but there wasn't like this force to mathematize the world. And I actually think I'm going to add something here too. I think one of the driving factors, which we haven't really touched on, and we can't really expand unfortunately too much on, given that we're running out of time, but I believe the drive to mathematize the world, which predates the Industrial Revolution, is the financial revolution, which begins in the Italian city-states in the 14th century. See, from the financial point of view, everything has to be mathematized because everything has to have an economic value, a price value. And so once everything has a price value, you've in a sense mathematized everything because, I mean, the finance is in some sense a subset of mathematics.
I would say that in that respect, China and the West is actually not that different because China was also have developed quite advanced in terms of statistics, but nothing like calculus. In that case, I guess the divergence is more Newton.
Yeah, right. Because I'm only saying what was the impetus
Yeah.
behind all of this because Newton is writing in the 17th century, and this begins in the 14th century, and this process unfolds. And so I think that unfolding financialization of the world is partly where a lot of this impetus to mathematize everything comes from.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, you then realize that you can engage in scientific processes, which was not the intent of the Italian merchants that started this whole thing, but it was a byproduct of it.
Yeah, I guess can we say that financialization, just like wealth, is an important precondition, but not really the spark?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I guess in that case, maybe we can say that financialization, just like general wealth of the society, is a necessary precondition for modern science, but not really the spark itself. The spark itself is someone like Newton that invented calculus.
Yeah, right. Because as you said, China had something similar but lacked a Newton, and so it didn't develop that way. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, yeah, because China, yeah, like I said, has already had all the precondition, but it didn't happen.
No, yeah, I think this was a. Is there anything else you want to add to the presentation and discussion?
I think this is pretty much the main point. The main point, like the difference between like the I guess the different concept of God as like a possible explanation to the difference between the two. And another thing, this is more like a small observation that I find very very interesting is that like in the West is either like polytheism and monotheism, but in China there is actually a a coexistence of a true God and the gods, so to speak. So I was wondering if this has some deeper implication anthropologically or socially. So this is something that is like an open question, more like.
Mm-hmm. It might. I mean, because if you those lower beings would be considered worthy of worship and veneration in a way that in the West, after the triumph of Christianity, they wouldn't be. And
Oh yeah,
so,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. This is actually a very interesting point. Is like the Lord is disinterested. The Lord doesn't really do small stuff. So you then look for the the gods with small g, because they are the ones who actually handle the afterlife, to actually handle the heaven and stuff like that. But they are not the Lord, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I think we
Yeah,
covered some interesting ground. Thanks
yeah,
for
yeah,
reaching out, Rain.
yeah. Do we have any interesting questions in the
Well, let's. I don't think we have any questions, but there's a couple people that liked you. Euthanasia said these episodes with Rain are always interesting, and then
Yeah,
Obsidian Rain
thanks.
said, "Yeah, I agree. He's a good guest." Let's see. Some of those questions were directed to me, which I already answered in the chat. I don't really see any directed at you.
Oh, I actually saw one. Uh, somebody said like Chinese visual view is like the Force in Star Wars. I think actually the Force was inspired from
Buddhism.
China. No, it's actually from kind of from Taoism, which actually the Force is actually inspired from the Lord above. I think because the Lord above technically behave a bit like the Force.
Yeah. There
Yeah.
was something else. I think somebody said. Genesis and Jory said, wasn't a lot of modern scientific philosophy based on the idea that God could be known through the abstract laws of the universe? The speaker you have on says a similar thing for Chinese thought. Well, I think you're saying the opposite, that the Chinese don't have that. But
Yeah, we don't have that. There's no attempt. Is considered like pointless to try to understand the how the Lord think, and people would just say like, oh yeah, I'm doing this because it's the Lord's will, but if he succeed, then he just say, oh yes, I did what the Lord wanted.
well, when you talked about like the lower G gods that are still worshipped in China, it almost kind of sounds like that there's like a you could like interpret this as like a metaphysical conspiracy where like the lower G gods are just like obscuring Tian from everybody, saying, "Oh, Tian doesn't care. Tian doesn't care." And as long as you don't get below these like entry level gods, you'll never actually get to this higher understanding of Tian.
Yes, there's quite present in Chinese when it's like fantasy fiction, is that the lower G god, they are actually not like they're actually just like like I said, like mortal with superpowers, and at some point their action get caught up to them. Like they get over their head, but in the end of the day, their actions still caught up to them because there's the Lord above them.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, where can people find you, Rain? Before we wrap this up.
So I have, like I said, I have a YouTube channel and I have Twitter. So if somebody want to ask me any specific question, they can DM me on Twitter or left a comment on my YouTube channel. So those are two way to reach out to me.
All right, Rain. Thanks for coming on. It's always a
Yes,
pleasure.
thanks for having me on.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.